So, first of all, we have to start with World War One. So, World War One obviously happened, and Germany ended up losing that. And so, as a consequence of that, you end up having the Versailles Treaty, right? The Treaty of Versailles, whatever. And within that, it was a thing where every other country was able to self-determine, right? So they were able to basically draw their borders based on what made sense in terms of what ethnicity lives where, right? Apart from the Germans. So the Germans were not able to do this, right? So within the Treaty of Versailles, first of all, the Rhineland was going to be under military occupation from the Allies, and so they weren't able to remilitarize like the Rhineland. Then on top of that, you had a ban on the Anschluss with Austria. So Germany and Austria couldn't unite, even though both those people are Germans. On top of that, you obviously had Sudetenland, which was basically in Czechoslovakia, which had 3 million ethnic Germans there. They weren't able to join in as well. And then on top of that, you also had many Germans who lived in Poland as well, right? But the Polish corridor had basically been carved out so that Poland had access to the sea, and the port city of Danzig, which is now Gdansk, that was made into a free city, right? So although the population there was 98% German, it was said that, right, the Germans and the Poles can have access to this, right? And something like I think 55% of their exports and 60% of their imports, like of Poland's imports and exports, came through that port, right? So kind of gives you an idea of just how central it was, right? But anyway, fast forward now, and you obviously have the rise of Hitler. So Hitler, obviously, in Mein Kampf, had laid it out. He wanted to do a Drang nach Osten, which is a drive for the east. He wanted basically Lebensraum, which is, taking a living space from like the ethnic Slavs and stuff, right? So invading Poland, invading eventually the Soviet Union, and using that land for a German settlement, right? So that was the plan of Hitler from the very, very beginning, way before he got into power. So now he got into power, how serious was he in terms of pushing through this policy? Now, in order to answer that question, first of all, we have to look at this not from a Western perspective, which what we're kind of used to, but more from an Eastern perspective, right? So first of all, we have to kind of bear in mind that, Germany and Poland end up having a non-aggression pact, right, from quite early on. So the reason for that is because Poland is sandwiched in between Germany, on the one hand, and the Soviet Union. And obviously, at the time of Poland's independence, right, it fought the Polish-Soviet War, which was very destructive, where the Soviet Union tried to basically retake Poland from them. So Poland was very, very worried about like this threat from the east, the kind of communists taking over. So they formed a non-aggression pact, right? And there was even talk of Poland joining the Anti-Comintern Pact, right? So this was with Germany, Italy, Hungary, etc., right? So the plan was that all these countries were going to come together and basically form a kind of a defensive and eventually an offensive organization, right? To basically stand up against the Soviet Union and eventually to invade the Soviet Union. So this was kind of the plan all along. However, Poland didn't end up joining this pact for many different reasons, yeah. But mainly it was to do with the fact of they couldn't agree with the Germans as to how and what was going to be carved up from the Soviet Union. So obviously both the Germans and the Poles wanted territory in Ukraine, because obviously Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, it's very fertile land, etc., etc. And also as well with regard to the Caucasus, which is further south, that's where all of Russia's oil is, right? 86% of the Soviet Union's oil was produced in the Caucasus. So there's a big debate about, are the Germans going to have it? Are the Poles going to have it? Etc. Etc. And because the talks on that kind of broke down, that's why Poland never joined the Comintern. But they were very, very close to actually joining it. Now, as we've covered in our previous videos surrounding World War II, right? So, for instance, we've had what if Britain and France invaded Nazi Germany? We've had what if Hitler never declared war on the USA, etc., etc., right? So we've got lots of videos on that. So definitely check those out once you've seen this one. But in that, we kind of cover the fact of, so the policy of appeasement was largely to do with the fact of Britain and France didn't want to fight another war, right? So obviously they'd lost many, many people, like in the First World War, and people, both in terms of the elites and also like the general population, were very sceptical about going to war. And so the policy of appeasement, both when it was, the Rhineland, then when it was the Anschluss with Austria, then when it was the Sudeten crisis, people were very much in favour of being like, okay, cool, just let the Germans be themselves and just whatever. Like, the Treaty of Versailles was a bit too harsh anyway, so we have to basically just, okay, let's just undo Versailles basically and just kind of let them do whatever, right? So from a strategic standpoint, from a public relations standpoint as well, it made sense to basically have appeasement, right? And as we covered in our video about what if Britain and France, invaded Nazi Germany, as we can see in terms of the statistics when it comes to like the rearmament, right? By 1939, Germany was spending more than twice as much on defence than Britain was. I still haven't been able to find the statistics for France, but as we know from our own timeline, in 1940, a full year after 1939, of course, right? Germany was able to beat Britain, France, the Low Countries, Denmark and Norway, all within the space of a few months within that summer, right? So we know from our own timeline that Germany was able to do that, and so there's nothing to suggest that, like, in 1939, Britain and France were not really prepared to fight Nazi Germany, right? So maybe it made sense for them to just look the other way when Germany invaded Poland. So we're going to get onto the invasion of Poland, and we're going to look at some of the wider things within that now. So first of all, obviously, with regard to the declaration of war against Germany because they invaded Poland, what we have to kind of think of is, okay, why did we decide to go to war because of Poland, right? So first of all, Czechoslovakia was a liberal democracy. It had a long-standing kind of alliance with France and with Britain, right? And yet we kind of just threw them under the bus, right? Meanwhile, Poland was a military dictatorship, and it had also passed some anti-Semitic laws as well, right? Obviously not as bad as Nazi Germany, but still, it was a thing where the case for us going to war to defend Poland was much weaker than it would have been for Czechoslovakia, and yet still we decided to do that. Why was that? Well, obviously, as we've said before, in terms of appeasement, it made sense from a national interest kind of standpoint, because obviously, people both in Britain and France, they'd seen what had happened in World War One, and they'd seen millions of people who had died in that war, and so they wanted to avoid that, and so they weren't in a big rush to kind of go into a second World War, right? So at all costs, they thought, right, let's just keep staving this off. Okay, cool. So the Germans, the Versailles Treaty is bad anyway. Let's just kind of throw it out anyway, whatever. Because in terms of Germans not be able to remilitarize their own territory, Germans not be able to unite with other Germans, let's just look the other way for this, right? However, when it came to the invasion of Poland, because Germany had already taken the rest of Czechoslovakia, so not just the state land, they'd taken the whole of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939, this was seen as a break from promise, right, that Hitler had made, that there would be no more territorial ambitions, right? So invasion of Poland was more just a fact of, right, you've already broken the promise with regards to Czechoslovakia, we can't trust you, and also we need to set an example to you, right? Because what you have to understand, as we covered in our other videos as well, is this whole thing of the balance of power, right? Certainly for Britain, they've always seen this in terms of on the continent, you never want to have one power becoming too dominant, right? So whether it's France, whether it's Germany, whether it's whoever, right? You always form alliances with the smaller countries, right, in order to resist your major big rival, right? So whichever country is most dominant on the continent, that's the one that Britain is always going to ally itself against, right? So obviously, although there's this kind of dragged Nack Osten, it still is a thing where Britain goes, okay, if Germany goes east, if they take Poland, if they invade the Soviet Union and take a lot of territory in the Soviet Union, what's going to end up happening is that Germany is going to have all these resources, all this land, right? And then they're going to be a massive threat to us. So it's better now to make a stand against them, right? So it's kind of a big gamble, really. So they're like, right, if we declare war on Germany, right, over the invasion of Poland, Hitler's going to just back off, and he's going to just be like, okay, cool. But the problem is that through appeasing Hitler all those times before, Hitler ended up having a lot of a derision. He ended up having a lot of contempt for the Western powers. So he was like, they haven't done anything up to this point. Why are we going to listen to them now, right? Surely, they're not serious people, right? So we don't have to listen to them. So when it came to the invasion of Poland, right? So obviously they invaded on the 1st of September, right, 1939. 2 days later, Britain and France declares war on Germany. But then on the Western Front, nothing happened until the next year when the Germans actually were the ones who were on the offensive, right? But in terms of with Poland, right, so obviously Poland's been attacked from the west by Germany. But then on the 17th of September, they end up being attacked by the Soviets, right? Now, why was that? Well, that's because a few weeks earlier, in late August, you had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right, which was an alliance, between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, right? So the reason for that is because, so from Stalin's perspective, he was like, okay, we want to basically expand a bit of territory and stuff, and also use that as kind of a buffer because we know that the Germans are coming, but we want as much land in between us and them as possible, right? So that's part of the reason for that. And then from the German perspective, there was like, okay, right, if we do this deal with the Russians, then we can like purchase some Russian oil as well, and some food, etc., etc. So it's kind of a win-win situation. And also as well, we get a free hand in dividing up Eastern Europe. So that was basically the overall plan. Now, there ended up being a second part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement, which came a little bit later. And this basically, there was a few little changes with regard to this, right? So the Soviet Union, originally had wanted to take Estonia, Latvia, Eastern Poland, and Bessarabia, which later became Moldova, and then also as well, with regard to some territory from the Finns and stuff. But obviously, because of the Winter War, 1939 to 1940, the Soviets ended up getting humiliated by the Finns. They did end up taking that territory, but it was a huge humiliation. It showed just how weak the Soviet army was after the purges of the late 30s. But anyway, in this second thing, it was to do mainly with who would occupy Lithuania, right? So, in the second one, the Soviets end up taking Lithuania. And the Germans weren't necessarily too happy with this, right? But they kind of end up going, okay, fine, you guys can kind of take this, right? The thing is, now the Soviet Union had a bit of an issue, right? Because first of all, whereas before, when you had your own borders and stuff, right? You had all these fortifications, you had all these defenses there, right? Now you've advanced further away. Now your defenses there are not going to be as strong. And on top of that, you've got rid of all these buffer states which are in between you and Nazi Germany, right? So while it was kind of buying time, and while it was kind of seen as a thing of, okay, we're creating more of a buffer for ourselves, in actual fact, all it's kind of doing is making it so instead of the Germans being far away from you, now they're right on your border. And the reason why Stalin decided to do this is because it actually has come out much later and stuff, right? But he was actually planning on doing a preemptive strike against the Germans, right? At the point at which he thought the Germans might come and attack the Soviet Union. So that's why he kind of was, expanding territory, right? And he was like, okay, cool, we are going to now go and attack Germany. So we want to be as close to the Germans as possible so we can do this preemptive strike. Now, the thing is, what Stalin didn't really take into consideration, right, is Hitler was fanatic and obviously he wanted to drive to the east. And he always saw the thing with Britain and France and stuff as kind of a sideshow, right? As much as we kind of centralised the Anglo-German part of the war, for Hitler, Britain was small potatoes, right? And it's kind of just a distraction because obviously he always wanted to go to the east, right? So Stalin never thought that Hitler would do a two-front war, right? So he never expected, while Germany is still at war with Britain, surely not going to be stupid enough to attack the Soviet Union, right? So that was what Stalin's big misjudgment was, right? So because he was waiting to do this big offensive, right? He hadn't really built up the defenses along the new German-Soviet border, right? And because he was like, well, this attack of the Germans is never going to come because they're still at war with England, right? Because of that, he wasn't prepared to do this preemptive strike at this point. And so what ended up happening is Germany had time and was like, right, okay, bang. And in June of 1941, that's when Operation Barbarossa happened. This is the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Germans. Now, the thing to note about World War II is this, right? As much as us in the West, that we try to centralise it and make it all about us, in reality, 88% of German casualties throughout the entire war took place on the Eastern Front. So obviously, this is the Soviet Union, and the Soviet people. They are the ones who defeated Nazi Germany. we helped, yeah, but it was done with their like soldiers, and it was done by their people, right? So realistically, World War Two was won by the Soviets, right? Which is not a very popular thing, and obviously in the comment section we're going to get loads of Americans being like, blah, 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 blah. But within this video I'm going to explain that a little bit more, right? So within this, there's three different scenarios, yeah. So, like basically, so obviously as we've said, Hitler's invaded Poland, right? Britain and France haven't declared war on Germany. They stay out of it, right? So at this point now, Germany has got no reason to strike west, and has got no reason to strike north, right? So Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, France, that they're all fine, right? You know, so there's no blitz, there's no battle of the Atlantic, there's none of all that stuff, right? Britain and France just stay out of it, right? So the question is, would Hitler have invaded the Soviet Union in 1940? This is a big kind of debate. I don't think, based on what I've kind of seen, right? So the first like proper plans for Barbarossa didn't take place until October 1940, right? And the plans were for the next summer, so 1941, for that to have taken place. So as much as people kind of might think, oh, like the war in like the West kind of like slowed things down, I don't think so, because Germany needed more time to build up, and also as well they needed to consolidate the gains that they'd already made, right? So I don't think they would have just invaded Poland and then like the next summer gone straight and invaded the Soviet Union, right? So more likely than not, the invasion of the Soviet Union still would have taken place in the summer of 1941. Maybe it would have been changed by a few months by the fact of like, you know, Britain end up sending troops to Greece, and like kind of, and those all the kind of things going on in the Balkans, and so that slowed them down a little bit by maybe a few weeks or maybe a few months. But it wasn't a major thing, right? And so, you know, the problem with like a lot of British people is that they kind of centralise it, and they don't realise that they were kind of the sideshows, right? So everything that happened in North Africa, all these kind of things, it's not really until the last year of the war, like the last 12 months of the war, so from like basically D-Day up until like the E-Day, right? It's only at that point when like the British and the Americans play a big part. So within this timeline here, Operation Barbarossa has happened, right? And so we're going to have three different scenarios. One in which you know, the British and French completely stay out of it and just let the Germans and the Russians like that do their thing, right? The second in which Britain and France, and by extension to a more limited extent the United States, support Russia, right? So not by sending troops and stuff, but like through military aid and stuff, right? So basically lend-lease. And the third one is one in which basically the British and the French, and by extension perhaps the Americans, give their support to Nazi Germany. Now, for a lot of people, that last one might seem completely improbable, right? So we're going to address that one first, right? But before we obviously get into all that, don't forget to obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't. Remember, we're trying to hit 2,000 subs by Christmas, so we can definitely do it. I've seen the numbers rising. It's been getting better, you know, it's much better. Rising up, back on my feet. Did my time, tip my chance. Anyway, back to the point. So anyway, so now we're talking about the serious history of it.